You realize that like good communications is not the same as talking all the time or being the loudest. Good communications is around actually taking complex ideas that you have taken a lot of time to sit with and struggle with and be able to convey them.
Hello everyone, my name is Aafreen. I am the Standing Global Youth Ambassador with Skills for Life Foundation. Welcome to the Zenith Mastermind. Before we begin, I want to start by sharing a small incident. So back in the year 2008, Barack Obama got elected to the presidency. I was about 10 years old. But there was this speech that really created sort of a revolution all across the world, what people usually refer to as the Yes We Can speech. I remember coming back home from school and my parents telling me, you must watch this, you have to watch this. But I got through 5-7 minutes of it, and I started wondering, why am I watching this? What's the point? And I couldn't really understand because obviously my 10-year-old intellect was not that advanced at that point in time. But what I did understand was that people were crying and I did not know why. 5 years down the line, when I was around 15, I watched the Yes We Can speech again. And I finally realized why were there tears. I realized that, when we watch movies, dramas, we cry, tears of joy sometimes because we're moved. But all of that is practiced. But when we communicate in real time, it is genuine, it is authentic. And that is when I also realized that communication can be powerful. It can change lives, it can move people, it can inspire teams to move into action. And that is what makes me so happy to share with you today that the topic of this month is communication. And I feel like it's such a beautiful coincidence that we have somebody with us today who is just as inspiring, who has just an amazing story, and who has worked so closely with President Obama. We have with us today Mr. Rohit Malhotra, who is the founder and executive director at the Center for Civic Innovation, based in Atlanta, Georgia. I've had the honor of listening to Rohit in 2 of his workshops. I've had the honor of listening to him in TED Talks. And all of those times, if there's one thing that I truly, truly admire about Rohit as a person, is that he is witty, he's funny, he's genuine, he's authentic, and he has this unique ability to connect with people. And Rohit, it is such a pleasure to have you with us today. Welcome to the Zenith Mastermind. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm so grateful to be here. I appreciate it. I wish I practiced more jokes now. I feel like when you put a clown on the spot.
No, well, I feel like you're so spontaneous. You don't need to practice jokes. It's just such a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, grateful to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. So, Rohit, we have a really diverse audience who will be listening to this interview. We have teenagers, we have young adults, we have professionals, we have parents, and everybody, each one of them is so eager to hear and listen and learn from you. And we're just glad to have you on this platform to share all of your experiences. Now, my real first question is this. We all agree that communication is a very important skill, and we all agree that we use it every day to connect with people, and we possibly cannot survive without communicating with the people around us because we need them to go on a daily basis. But when is it that you realized the importance of communication as a skill and what impact it would have in your life?
Yeah, I think that you realize how important communications is when you don't do it right. And so the consequence of poor communication is probably the greatest lesson that you can learn. And when you are someone like me who, grew up just encouraged to talk all the time, and I think my parents were just so excited that they had a child that could speak complete sentences as their first child, that they encouraged me to talk all the time. And I don't think they knew what they were setting themselves in the world up for, but you realize that like good communications is not the same as talking all the time or being the loudest. Good communications is around actually taking complex ideas that you have taken a lot of time to sit with and struggle with and be able to convey them. And I think it wasn't until I started to deal with complex topics, whether that's topics of how I grew up or, complicated things that were happening in the world that I'm learning about. I think good communications comes from a point of tension and conflict and learning. And so, I learned it from a young age where, it wasn't enough to just be the one who talks the most. I needed to be the one who can most clearly convey what they're trying to say. And so, yeah.
Well, you say your parents did not know what they were stepping into. I'm personally really glad that, they helped you nurture that skill, because we have a great communicator among us today because they played such a good role. So, yeah, well, thank you to mom and dad.
Yes, always, yes.
What would you say were the defining moments in your life?
Yeah. So my communications journey started when I was 1 year old, and learned. We moved from the U.S. back to India, where my parents thought they may want to raise their child there. And so the first language I learned was a mix between Punjabi and Hindi. And then when they decided that they no longer wanted to live in India, they were like, never mind, we definitely want to go back to the U.S. When they came back to the U.S., I spoke a mix between Hindi and Punjabi in preschool. And so while everyone was singing about things in English, and there were songs, and it was a Lutheran preschool, so we were singing about Jesus, but I was singing about it in a Punjabi accent and and with my own words. And so and then I would run around, like when we were kids. Our parents had a small store in a mall, and we used to hide under the cart in the mall, and we would listen to our parents they were small business owners, and so they were small business owners that were just trying to make a living, and so we would listen to them doing sales and small little transactions, and I think my sister and I used to just hide under, if there was a trade show, we would be under a booth. And it wasn't until people started to become, try to take advantage of my parents or be condescending to my parents, that because they knew my parents' English wasn't as quick as theirs may have been, that my sister and I would come out and we showed how quick our English is. And so we realized that another asset that we had was that English as a communications tool was a shield for our parents, who experienced a lot. And then, that translated into my career, and just in undergrad, again, I learned how to tighten a lot of what I was saying. I could usually just exhaust people by just running my mouth for longer than they could, and that's how I would win the argument. But then what I learned is that you can do it a lot quicker and save a lot more time if you can just be more succinct and clear and direct with what you're trying to say. And as a philosophy major in college, and I was a philosophy major by accident, but that is not exactly your immigrant parents' dream for their child to go and be studying philosophy, but through that, I kind of learned the art of how historically people have communicated very complex topics. And in my journey of work, I heavily focused on how do we make it so that we end suffering for people, and that we treat people with dignity, and we push people through kind of bending that arc of justice toward stronger civil and human rights for people. And a lot of that, again, comes from my parents' journey of growing up the way they did in India, and like having grandparents who were activists during the partition of India. I kind of already had it baked into my soul that that's what I was going to be thinking about all the time. But you have to understand poverty. And this is what I mean by, it's one thing to run your mouth about, yes, there are people experiencing poverty. Yes, there are people who are in tough circumstances, but that's not how people talk about themselves. They don't talk about themselves as impoverished or marginalized. They talk about themselves just like everyone else does, by what they like, what they don't like, how they feel, how they're not feeling. And when you start to humanize the context that you are trying to communicate, it makes you a lot more effective at communicating it, because you actually believe in it. You're not just learning it to say it. That's what I was doing with all those prayers before we would get food, like that. I learned the words and just said it, but it wasn't translating to me because it wasn't contextualized. I didn't understand it. I didn't feel it. Whereas in this work, when you start to get to know people who are going through these types of circumstances, and you get to know their families, and they invite you over for dinner, and you talk about music together, then it's a lot easier for you to advocate for something like that, or to talk about something like that, because it's rooted in human experience. And so I've learned that through the early stages of my career, and had the opportunity to figure out how to translate that type of work online for a few cool folks, and then came back to Atlanta, and every day my work depends on our communications. How successful we are and how much trust we're able to build depends on how well we're able to communicate what we're trying to do. So yeah, it's an everyday part of my life, but those have been some milestones throughout it.
From what you mentioned, it is particularly beautiful that now communication has evolved in a way that we don't need to speak in a particular language in order to, make a connection with people. The world has evolved to an extent where people just consider good communication that connects, like you said, to be the perfect kind of communication, because so long as we're connecting with people, we're good. I've had the honor of listening to you in a lot of workshops, and I feel like one thing that really helps you connect with your audience is the wit and humor that you bring to any conversation. So what I want to know is, what role do you think humor plays in particularly connecting with people on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I mean, I think forced or planned humor is usually where it goes off the worst. I think that some of my favorite comedians that I listen to are just, they're not just comedians, they're historians. They're brilliant people who have taken the time to work through complex topics, and they are controversial people who are imperfect. But that's where I think humor, the root word, is the same root word as humanity, and I think there's it's a centering of who we are. We're imperfect, and I think being able to experience joy in that imperfection is often the most common misconception. People think that social justice work or a fight to be better always has to be sad or has to be traumatic. But if there's anything we've learned from even civil rights heroes who have passed recently, there's great joy in protests. There's great joy in doing this type of work, and so when you lean into that joy, it allows you to have a couple laughs here and there, and that's beautiful. But for me, it's also about not taking yourself so seriously. I'm imperfect in this work. Not everything I do is right, and I think I have to leave room for that. If I tell you that I am so certain and this is what it is, and there's no other way to think about it, now you have to hold me accountable to that. But if I tell you, here are my thoughts, and I'm also could be wrong, and then it leaves a little bit more room for you to give me a little bit of grace. Because I don't think what people are looking for in communications is perfection. I think they're looking for authenticity. I think they want the truth. They don't want to have to read between what it is that you're saying. And if you can build that authenticity, that starts to build, that's kind of the building block of trust. Whereas if you say, I can do it alone, that's the greatest way to polarize people.
I feel like that is especially very important for young people to hear, because from the kind of world that we live in, we're often told that we're supposed to be a certain way, look a certain way, talk a certain way, and that ideally we have to be perfect all the time. But then I relate to what you say, because I feel like most of the times I end up admiring someone when they say, I don't know, rather than trying to justify or explain what they do know. So that really does make a lot of sense. Our lives are, really driven by ups and downs, and so are our styles of communications, or the way we try to connect with people. So do you have any failures in communication or any moments of miscommunication that you would like to share?
It's a good question. It's a marathon. Like this work is not a sprint, it's a marathon. Like if you, every single day there's an opportunity to communicate better, because you have more and more people that you are communicating with, and those touch points are different for each person. How you communicate with one person is not necessarily the same way you communicate with someone else. I have, if you think about the work that I do, sometimes my job is to be a disruptive communicator. So I have gone to board meetings and spoken out against things that I think are wrong at the city level. And I've had, the mayor of this city go completely at me, right? And how you communicate through conflict and tension matters. Because on one hand, I'm not apologetic of believing what I believe, and that it's rooted in good information, and it's rooted in humanity, and it's rooted in good intention. But not everyone is going to receive you in the way that you perceive yourself. And so it's really important to find that balance. But yeah, I've made elected officials upset. I've made people that I work with I've challenged them with communication, which everyone needs, has different layers of that. But there's no I was on stage once and then I accidentally just started cursing everybody out on stage, and then that never happened. But that's also because I'm intentional with my communication, and it goes back to the place we started from, which is good communication starts from that point of complexity. And you have to be able to sit with information before you start talking about it. And so, probably most of the time when I mess up on talking about stuff is when I haven't taken the time to actually sit with it.
That kind of makes me wonder. So what role would feedback play in communication?
I think it depends on you, right? I think that there's too much of a push for everybody to kind of do communications one way, or communications is about authenticity. There are going to be times where you may have come off a way that you didn't want to, or that you said something that was perceived to be another way, and you have to be ready to receive that. That's for sure. But at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that this is something I'm guilty of all the time. Sometimes I get into being so self-conscious about what I'm saying is being perceived, or how someone has perceived it, that I forget why I was even saying it in the first place. And I lose all groundedness in why I was communicating in the first place. There is there is risk in the way that you put your words out there. But what that doesn't mean is that now you need to enter a space in which you can't say anything because you're afraid of the consequences of what it's going to mean, because you'll lose the ability to stay grounded in what you were trying to say. And so sometimes you're not ready to receive feedback. And you have to be in a mind space to be open to receiving it. And if you're not, you're never going to receive it well. And if you know that in a moment you are not ready to receive certain types of feedback, don't take it, because you're not in a space to receive it. And that matters.
Yeah. So what I understand from that is that taking feedback from yourself is just as important as taking feedback from others.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I'm gonna take feedback on this interview for myself after this, right? Like, there's like you can continuously do it to be better. I think as long as it's healthy and it's toward a productive goal.
Absolutely. Now that we're talking about young people, there's this really important component in the life of every young person, and that is friends. And especially when I remember when I was a teenager, I used to have very common conflicts with my friends all the time. So what role or what do you want to say to that? What do you want to say to conflict in friendship and communication in friendship?
Yeah, I grew up really lucky with, I've had the same 5-6 best friends since I was a kid. And I just saw them yesterday, distanced, of course, but we went for a walk, and and then for a couple of the folks who are not in the country or not in the state, we did a Zoom call and made sure that they were included. It's very easy for you to put communications with your friends and for your family on the back burner. It's very difficult to prioritize them, but the gift of prioritizing them pays dividends than the consequence of deprioritizing them.
That's beautiful. I love that. So now that you're talking about that, let's talk about the steps that young people need to take in order to inculcate communication as a skill, both in their professional and their personal lives.
Actually read and watch people that you admire. And there's so much you can learn about communications by not saying anything and just listening and learning. And I remember when I was trying to do when I was doing our first TED Talk, it was, I'm not someone who's uncomfortable on stage. I'm more uncomfortable when I'm if someone puts me in a networking situation. I don't do that well, but on stage I feel very comfortable. And but I remember feeling stuck on the communications that I was trying to do around preparing this TED Talk, and I felt stuck. I was like, I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I can convey what it is that I'm trying to say. And I watched a author. Her last name is Adichie, and she's the author of Americana. She did a TED Talk on the danger of a singular story, and that talk led me to listen to her again and listen to her again, and she was talking about the world in a way that was so different from mine, and yet she taught me so much. She didn't give me steps to communication. There's no book to read about here are the 5 things you do to be a better communicator. But instead I was I want to be able to convey that thought, and she gave me an avenue on how you can do that. And I think that's the beauty of communication, is it's a building exercise and it has building blocks. And so some of the best things you can do is just listen to and read and talk to some of the people you admire most, and it'll open up parts of your brain to be able to be better at communications. The other thing I would say is that logic exercises are actually quite powerful. Some of the oldest philosophers in the world used logic exercises to strengthen the way that they would talk about their work. And so one of the greatest activities that even the founding fathers would do is you would write 20 pages of something, but the goal was to get it down to 5 paragraphs. And that's the harder thing. And when they weren't able to do that, you'll see there was a common phrase in the 1700s where they would say, "I'm sorry I couldn't write you a shorter letter." It was considered to be an art to be able to take lots of information and consolidate it down. And so actually using logic exercises is a great way to start centering the way that you talk about your work, which is a big takeaway for me.
That's very interesting. I did not know that. Sorry about not being able to write you a short letter. That is actually, I didn't know that. That's amazing. I really wish we could have talked for longer, but let's just move into our final segment, because I know you have a lot on your plate right now and you've just taken out so much of your time, which is so appreciated. What message would you like to give to the young people who will be listening to this video?
Since the topic is communications here, I think the message for me is about authenticity and like us getting back to a place where everyone feels like they are good enough to work toward being the best version of themselves. And I think to not worry about trying to be someone else or to communicate like someone else, but to communicate like the best version of you. And to also center your communications around who you are trying to communicate to. Who is it that's important that receives your message? And challenge yourself, right? Like you become a stronger communicator when you've taken the time to understand complex information. You have the ability to actually, you've sat with something. And so when you're saying it, it means more. And that's a really powerful thing.
I feel like that's exactly what young people need to hear right now, because they want to look towards the future, but the world is an uncertain place right now. So I feel like that would really help them and motivate them. And so will this conversation. Thank you so much for being with us, Rohit. It was such a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, I loved it. Thank you so much for the time. I appreciate it.